When you think about handheld Nintendo consoles, what games do you think about? No, seriously, this is a genuine question, because if you're anything like me, your mind probably immediately thinks about Pokemon. But there is another game I think about, and that game is The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. Originally released for the Game Boy in 1993, and then getting re-released with a director's cut version for the Game Boy Color, and finally getting a complete remake for the Nintendo Switch, Link's Awakening served as a direct sequel to A Link to the Past, the game that came before it on the SNES. Even though A Link to the Past basically created the Zelda formula, that doesn't mean that this game wasn't innovative either. Alongside Pokemon Red and Blue, Link's Awakening was one of the major titles that really made portable gaming as big as it is. Beyond that, Link's Awakening also innovated on Zelda games by implementing many gameplay ideas and mechanics that would be used time and time again in future titles. For this video, I am going to be playing the director's cut version, as other than adding color, it does not change much from the original game. After seeing the intro cutscene where Link is struck by lightning and then found by Marin on Koholint Island, you immediately find yourself in Marin's house, who tells Link about how she found him unconscious on the beach. If you talk to Marin's dad, Tarim, he gives you the shield. This is significant because most of the time in Zelda you are either given the sword first or both the sword and shield at the same time. This just shows that Link's Awakening did not try to innovate too much, but rather it tried to experiment with what already worked in A Link to the Past. This isn't seen just through the game breaking common Zelda tropes, but the game's design also reinforces this idea. As soon as you leave Marin's house, you find yourself in Mabe Village. Here you find many NPCs to talk to, and I have to say one of my favorite things about this game is the characters. There is this whole trading sequence that takes place throughout most of the game, and this just adds so much character seeing what each one of these characters gives you. Completing this doesn't go unrewarded though. After finishing it, you obtain the magnifying lens, which is required to access the Windfish's egg and beat the game. You also can gain access to the boomerang. This weapon is quite powerful, doing a lot of damage and having range, but its best use case is one-shotting the final phase of the final boss of the game. Considering that this item takes a lot of work and is quite hard to find, this is a really good reward. Link's Awakening follows a similar structure to A Link to the Past. The game was originally intended to be a Game Boy port of that game. However, it ended up becoming a completely different game. The main goal of this game is to take your ocarina to the Windfish's egg, which is located in the mountains near the top of the island. Here, you must play the Ballad of the Windfish with 8 other musical instruments that you would have collected throughout your journey. To get these instruments, you must complete 8 dungeons. After getting the shield, you are taught how it works by pushing these enemies to get the sword. This is a good way to introduce the player to the shield, as in this game it has gotten a complete overhaul. In the Zelda games before this, the shield acted as a passive effect that would block certain projectiles automatically. In this game, you need to hold either the A or B buttons down for it to be in effect, and it can block more than just projectiles, assuming the damage is coming from in front of Link. And just like the other main items in this game, it can be unequipped or equipped with either your A or B buttons. This is a little bit annoying, as this means that after you have gotten a few items, it becomes very repetitive to constantly open up your inventory and switch between items. However, this game was on the Game Boy, which had a D-pad, 2 face buttons, and start and select buttons. Of course, this was fixed in the Switch remake, with items such as the sword, shield, and Pegasus boots having dedicated buttons. If you start exploring these early areas after getting the sword, you may find the first dungeon. However, you will need a key to access it. This is the thing that I like about this game the most. Whilst Zelda has never fully gone down the route of a Metroidvania game, it has taken aspects from games like this. In my opinion, this game takes the most from the Metroidvania genre than every other Zelda game. With the exception of Turtle Rock, Catfish's Maw, and Bottle Grotto, all the dungeons in this game require you to obtain a key before you can enter. And even still, Turtle Rock requires you to learn the Frog's Song of Soul, and Bottle Grotto requires you to bring a chain chomp to the dungeon entrance. That's another thing with Link's Awakening. When designing it, the developers thought they could get away with adding Mario characters in the game because it was on the Game Boy. This is kind of ironic now because the game became the 4th best-selling Zelda. So we got Chain Chomps, Goombas, Piranha Plants, a Yoshi doll, Princess Peach, Thwomp, Bloopers, Cheep Cheeps, Shy Guys, Tarin kinda looks like Mario, and there's also Kirby because why not at this point. But I'm getting off topic. When you realize that you don't have the key to get into Tail Cave, you'll probably go back to Mabe Village. After all, there was a bush there that you can now cut to get into the mysterious forest. You'll find this raccoon who will always teleport you to a random part of the forest if you try to go to the screen above him. What you need to do is to get the magic powder from this witch and go back to the raccoon to use it on him. Now you can get the key. This isn't the only example of Link's Awakening using Metroidvania game design ideas. Things like this are found throughout the game. Like when you get the magic powder, you will see this heart piece that you can't get yet. But when you get the Rock's Feather in Tail Cave, you'll immediately think back to this area, which just so happens to be in the same direction you need to go to save this Chain Chomp from the Moblin's hideout. And this isn't just seen in the overworld. The dungeons also use these Metroidvania concepts just like most Zelda dungeons do. This was my first 2D Zelda game, and what I found interesting is that a lot of these 2D Zelda games let you have multiple small keys at once. This came as a surprise to me, as bar a few exceptions, 3D Zelda games normally do not have dungeons where you can hold multiple small keys at once. But in this game and other 2D Zelda games, most if not all of the dungeons have you obtaining and using multiple small keys at the same time. In fact, Key Cabin is completely built around this idea. This lets Link's Awakening be more difficult with its puzzles. So unlike other early game dungeons like the Great Deku Tree, Tail Cave isn't too much easier than the other dungeons just because it is the first one. Instead, Tail Cave still remains quite difficult without overwhelming the player. Immediately you are presented with an option. Either go left and get a key and the compass, or go forwards and go further into the dungeon. If you go forwards first, then you will eventually run out of keys and will need to go back. This is Link's Awakening's way of teaching the player how dungeons work. In this game, you are encouraged to explore every area you see and look for keys so that you can open locked doors. And if you see a locked door but don't have a key, that means that you missed one and you'll have to go back. The compass helps a lot with this. In A Link to the Past, it would simply tell you where the boss was located. But in Link's Awakening, the compass instead gives you an audio cue to tell you when there is a key. There is also another new item in the form of the stone beak that will give you hints when placed into an owl statue. This is implemented well as it gives the player a little extra help as a reward for exploring, and it is a way for the game designers to help the player without the use of a companion character like in other games. Now I'm not going to look at every dungeon in this game, but I will look at some noteworthy examples of where Link's Awakening excels in dungeon design. So after you get this key and the compass and head forward, the dungeon now gives you many rooms to explore. On the right side you will find the stone beak and the entrance to fight the mini-boss, which we need an item to access. On the left side you will find the Rock's Feather, which is that item. The middle of the dungeon simply acts as an access point to get to the two halves of the dungeon, and has a key for you to grab. Now using the Rock's Feather, you can now access the area to fight the mini-boss. Once defeated, you will find a warp portal that can take you to the start of the dungeon. This is found after every mini-boss in the game. You'll find this room that will lead you to the boss. Most players, including myself, would have gotten to this point without finding the big key. Unlike A Link to the Past, Link's Awakening requires you to get the big key to fight the boss, rather than needing it to get the dungeon's item. So the game tells you to go back and find this area that was also blocked off by the requirement of needing the Rock's Feather to get the big key. Because of the big key, Tail Cave may seem like a fairly linear dungeon at first, but if you hold that assumption, then the dungeon will trick you and make you backtrack to find what you missed. This dungeon lays down the blueprints for the exceptional dungeon design of this game, and even helped make ideas for future Zelda games. In Bottle Grotto, you are introduced to these crystal switches that can raise and lower these platforms with a sword swing. The dungeon opens with you getting 4 keys, and then another key after getting the power bracelet. The dungeon also has this chest which contains rupees, and whilst it isn't helpful to the progression of the dungeon, it helps the player think about the options they have. You see, this chest is found at the very start of the dungeon, but can't be obtained unless you get the power bracelet, So having the game do this makes it easier for the player to think and remember if there is anything that they missed. And they'll need to think about this, as one of these rooms requires you to defeat these enemies in a specific order, which can be learned from talking to an owl statue. This is quite a step up from Tail Cave, which had 3 keys, that were all obtained before the dungeon item. This then happens again in Key Cavern, which has 9 keys, although 4 of those keys are completely optional, so that kinda makes those 9 keys feel more like 5. But still, these extra keys can confuse the player, as they may use them on doors that are not required. Of course, being the only dungeon that is named after keys, Key Cavern ends up having the most keys out of any dungeon, if you count the optional keys. Aside from Angler's Tunnel, which has 4 keys, and Turtle Rock, which has 7, every dungeon after Bottle Grotto has exactly 3 keys. On paper, this might make these dungeons look simple, but these dungeons still manage to feel harder than the last, which is done using a few tricks. For example, in Angler's Tunnel, there is this key that drops in a hole. To get it, you must get the flippers, and then backtrack down these stairs to grab the key. As I mentioned before, I believe that out of every Zelda game, Link's Awakening takes the most from the Metroidvania genre. And this isn't just seen here. In every dungeon, the dungeon's item acts as a key for many different areas of the dungeon. On the other hand, Catfish's Maw introduces the idea of having to go to 4 different areas and fight the Master Stalfos to get the dungeon item. This is a good concept, as it both uses backtracking and forces the player to fight this enemy 4 times, really testing their combat capabilities. So by the time they get the hookshot, the player will have a good understanding of the dungeon layout and can easily find all areas that are available. If that isn't satisfying, I don't know what is. Probably the most important dungeon that Link's Awakening has to offer is Eagle's Tower. Whilst the last dungeon, Turtle Rock, relies on having multiple keys and a lot of areas to be difficult, Eagle's Tower approaches difficulty in a completely different way. Whilst there is only 3 keys, this dungeon is the only dungeon in the entire game that takes place on multiple floors. But also there is this ball that you have to take to 4 pillars in the dungeon and throw the ball at the pillars to break them. Once all 4 pillars break, the dungeon changes as the 3rd floor has a complete transformation. This kind of turns the ball into another key, but it still isn't that simple. You see, you won't be able to just hit every pillar that easily. It is important to note that each of these rooms with the pillars has some sort of wall or obstacle that will stop you from reaching the pillar with the ball in hand. So to fix this issue, you must throw the ball to the area you want it to be, and then take a different route to end up in the same place as the ball. This is crucial to the dungeon's design, as it makes the player think about 1, where to throw the ball, and 2, how they will get to that place. Eagle's Tower also has a lot of paths that are blocked off by the requirement of needing to hit a crystal switch, which just adds to the complexity of the dungeon, as when you need to make your way to the ball, you might have missed a crystal switch and be blocked off from the ball. Gimmicks like this would eventually become ever present in future Zelda games. I like to call this a dungeon gimmick, so it would be similar to things like the different water levels in Ocarina of Time's Water Temple, the shifting of the Divine Beasts in Breath of the Wild, and the monkeys in the Forest Temple of Twilight Princess. As far as I know, this was the first example of one of these dungeon gimmicks, so it being here was very important to the dungeon design of future games. Whilst Turtle Rock mainly relies on being non-linear and having many keys to be a final challenge for the game, it also has a dungeon gimmick. There are these blocks that you can push to make platforms, letting you cross areas you normally can't. Whilst this dungeon gimmick isn't as complex as the ball in Eagle's Tower, it does make the dungeon a lot less linear, as this room can lead to many different rooms depending on the way you push this block. The dungeon item this time is the Magic Rod. This is good as it lets you melt ice, and because there were so many different areas with ice, mixed with how non-linear the dungeon feels, this makes a great addition to the dungeon. This is probably the best example of Link's Awakening using its items to benefit its dungeons, as now the Magic Rod acts as a key for multiple locks, encouraging the player to go back and explore. After beating the dungeon, you now have all 8 musical instruments that you need to enter the Windfish's egg. If you haven't finished the training sequence, you'll need to do it now, as you will need the magnifying lens to find the secret code for the Windfish's egg. I like this trading sequence, as unlike other required missions, you can start it from pretty much the start of the game. Once the trading sequence is finished, You can use it to find the secret code and then go back to the windfish's egg to use that secret code and beat the final boss. The end of the game reveals that this whole game was a dream. I had fun with this game, however it did get quite repetitive by the end, so I'll put it in A tier.